Good morning, everybody. I hope you had a nice, safe, and happy 4th of July yesterday, and happy 4th of July weekend. I just want to let you know that we do have forthcoming plans to begin meeting again in person when our state begins phase 3 of the governor's reopening plans. So you may have received an email about that from Elder David, and you will find more details about that soon on our website. We usually put that kind of information on our website at en.ecc-skc.org. And that also includes some of our online giving options. So please continue to give faithfully, and we thank you for just kind of, bearing with us and being with us during this time. So last week, we finished our short series on the Lord's Prayer. And hopefully that has kind of helped you to rethink maybe the prayers that you pray, or maybe has encouraged you to pray more. And this week we're going to begin a new series titled Faithful in Exile. And I want to give you a little bit of context, a little bit of background on my thinking on this. So if you might remember, before our prayer series, we were looking at the book of Habakkuk, right? And you might remember in that book, Habakkuk, the prophet, he was lamenting the sins of Israel, and he was questioning God, like, aren't you going to do something about this, Lord? And the answer that he got, God said, yes, I am. I'm going to send the Babylonians as an instrument of my punishment. And we know from history that indeed Babylon did come and conquered Judah, and then besieged the city of Jerusalem, and they ended up overcoming it and destroying the temple. And then Babylon, they exiled the Jews, right? And they basically dragged them away from their homeland, the promised land, and forced them to live as foreigners in another land. And this is where our next series that we're starting today, it picks up here. At this point, we're going to be looking at the books of Daniel and Esther. And during this period that we're looking at, the Jews, they are living in exile. Right? They are struggling with their identity. And they're starting to ask themselves this question: how can we worship God when we no longer have our temple? Right? How can we worship without our temple, and we're no longer able to do all the sacrifices and all these things? How can we worship without our temple? How can we worship when we're no longer allowed into our church building, when we can't gather for small groups? We can't share meals together, or we can't go on mission trips, or we can't even sing on Sunday mornings together. How can we stay faithful in exile, right? And so that's kind of the question that the Jews had to wrestle with. And I think we're kind of wrestling with that same question right now. And so I hope we'll be able to continue to wrestle with that question for the next couple weeks as we look at the books of Daniel and Esther in this new sermon series titled Faithful in Exile. And so today's message is titled Picky Eaters. And this is the well-known story of Daniel and his 3 friends, and they are refusing to eat the king's food, right? But it's not really about food. It's more about not compromising your values and sticking to your convictions. It's about staying faithful in exile. And the book of Daniel starts like this. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. And so here, this is just a little bit of the background. I just went over it earlier. The city was besieged, right? And the temple was plundered. And Yahweh's holy relics, they were taken away from their rightful place, right? The vessels of the house of the God, these holy relics, they were taken from their rightful place and then put into the treasury of a pagan god, right? The god of the Babylonians. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. So here in this section, we see the king, he's commanding that these youths, without blemish, they are to be brought into the king's service. And the word youths indicates they're not children, right? They're not boys, but are not yet men. And so most scholars think that these youths, they are probably about 16, 17, 18 years old or so. And they are to be educated in the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans are the Babylonians. Okay. Now imagine a high school graduate. Right? We have some graduates in our midst, and they're having to go to a completely foreign country. Okay. Right? They're going there for college. Okay. They're being shipped off. And they have to go to this totally foreign country, and they have to learn the language of this foreign country. And they have to learn the culture. They have to learn the history. They have to adapt to a different educational system. And they have to adapt, right? And that's basically what's happening here. These Jewish youths, right, they're the cream of the crop. Right? They are the best and the brightest, right, without blemish. And they're being brought to Babylon to adapt, to learn this new culture, to learn these new ways. They're being forced to assimilate. They even have to learn to love the local foods, right? The food and the wine. Right? They had to learn to adapt to a different kind of food. And they're not just eating, street food. They're eating the most delicious of Babylonian cuisines. I mean, this is prepared for the king. This is a king's feast, right? Literally. And after these 3 years of college, right, these youths, right, they were going to be sent to serve as cultural ambassadors, government officials of some sort. They would be put into the service of the king, and presumably they would serve maybe their own people, maybe elsewhere. We don't know. But this is actually pretty brilliant of Nebuchadnezzar. Because Nebuchadnezzar, he had this huge empire, right? The Babylonians, we learned about how they would go and conquer all these empires, these other nations. And Nebuchadnezzar knew that the punishment and threat of force, it would only control a people for so long. But to really own them, to really own a people, you had to win their hearts and their minds. You had to win hearts and minds. And so that's what Nebuchadnezzar did. And he began by re-educating, right, these youths. And not just these youth who would later go on to serve their prospective countries and nations. He was re-educating the people. And he kind of reshaping them, reforming them, giving them a new identity so that they would assimilate into the Babylonian Empire, right? The Babylonian culture. Now consider how much a child's education affects their worldview. I was born in Taiwan. I moved to America when I was very young, and I've been raised here in America. And I went to public school. I learned English. I learned American history, America's version of history. I learned to enjoy American foods. And I was an American. I grew up an American. I became an American. And, I really believed with all my heart that America was, the greatest nation on earth. Yay. God bless America, USA, USA. And I grew up and I was so proud to be an American. And then I moved back to Taiwan later in my teenage years. And I carried with me this American patriotism, right? I carried with me back to Taiwan this American patriotism, which now looking back, I realize it was actually just this false belief in American exceptionalism. Okay, but regardless, I moved back to Taiwan. I was proud to be an American, and I began to look down on everything around me, because it never quite measured up to what it was like in America, the greatest nation on earth, right? And I was living in Taiwan, and I would kind of look down at everything and oh, the food, ew, stinky tofu, nasty. We would never have anything like that in America. Or, oh, why would they eat with chopsticks? It's like two sticks. That's so uncivilized. Why can't they just eat with a knife and a fork and a spoon like civilized people? Or I would kind of look down on the language and oh, how come there's like thousands and thousands of characters in Chinese? I mean, why can't they just use an alphabet like everybody else? Gosh, Or the culture, the way they did things, and I would always kind of criticize, like, oh, it's Taiwan and Chinese counterfeits, and they're always trying to rip things off, and Americans, they are the true innovators, right? And so I had this disdain for anything not American. I really felt like anything that Taiwan did, America would do better. Right? And Nebuchadnezzar, he would have loved me. I mean, he would have loved this. I mean, this is exactly what Nebuchadnezzar was going for. He wanted cultural evangelists, right, to go and tell their own people, oh, Babylon does it better. Babylon is the best. We should become like Babylon. Right? Because Nebuchadnezzar knew to control a people, you don't need to rule them with an iron fist. You need to win their hearts and their minds. And then you need to convince them that your way is better. And then you've owned them. Have we as Christians, have we become convinced that the world's way is better? Have we too been so brought up in the literature and language of the Chaldeans that we no longer think or act any differently? Is the world's way the best way? Is our worldview more shaped by faith in American nationalism or by our faith in the Word of God? Is this where we get our values? Is this where we get our identity from? I'm not saying that we need to pull our kids out of public school or send them to Christian schools or homeschool them. I'm not saying we shouldn't consume any media or participate in anything secular. Right? That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying I think we need to be aware that the culture we live in shapes us. It shapes our way of thinking, our way of viewing. It shapes our worldview, right? And then it tests our loyalties. Nebuchadnezzar knew this very well, and then he used it to his benefit. Verse 6. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. And so here again we see another attempt to assimilate these Jewish youths by giving them new names. And at first glance we might think, well, this is harmless, right? They're just being given local names in the Babylonian language so that, the locals would be able to pronounce it and understand it. But there's actually something much deeper going on here. Okay, there's something else going on here. So you know me as Jim, my American name, Jim, right? Pastor Jim. But that's not my given name. My given name was actually Liang Jinghan. Liang Jinghan. My parents gave me that name. And that name, it's tied to our family tradition, and it has a deep meaning. But when we moved to America, the Jing in Liang Jinghan, right? Jing, that middle character, it got transliterated into Jim. Jing became Jim. And then all that heritage, all that tradition, all that meaning, it literally got lost in translation. I'm just Jim now, right? Just Jim. And the same thing happened when these Jewish youths, they were given these new names. Something deep, something meaningful was lost in translation. These youths, their names were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Right? These names that they were given meant something. Their names actually honored God, as most Hebrew names do in some way. Right? Like American names, we're usually, named after a celebrity or somebody famous or an apostle or a saint or something like that, right? But Hebrew names, they honored God in a different way. Their names literally meant something about God, and so El means God, and Yah means Yahweh, and so we see here, right, Daniel literally means God is my judge. Hananiah literally means Yahweh has been gracious to us, or to me. Yahweh has been gracious. Or Mishael, right, the El, who is what God is. Like there is no one else like our God, right? Who is what God is? Nobody. There's no other God like our God. And Azariah, Yahweh, has helped. And so not only were these names, when they were given these new Babylonian names, not only was this lost in translation, something else was added in its place. Right? So we see that Daniel is renamed Belshazzar. And Hananiah is Shadrach, Mishael is Meshach, and Azariah becomes Abednego. And these Babylonian names, in the same way, honored the Babylonian deities, the Babylonian gods of Bel and Nabu. Okay, so these new names honored the Babylonian gods. And in the very act of renaming them this way, Nebuchadnezzar is trying to erase their heritage, but also declare, our gods are greater than your God. Our gods are greater than your gods. Our gods own you now. We own you. We own you. So this isn't just a story about 4 Jewish youths being given new names. This is a story about staying faithful in exile, not losing ourselves, preserving our identity as children of God in a godless society. Right? That's what this is really about. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And so apparently the Babylonian cuisine was not kosher. It was not prepared and in line with the strict dietary laws that Moses gave the Jews, the Israelites. There are a bunch of these laws. We can find a bunch of them in the book of Leviticus. There were certain animals that were considered unclean and not to be eaten, reptiles, invertebrates like insects, and so there were certain foods like certain birds like scavenger birds, vultures, things like that should not be eaten. Fish without scales. There were all these laws that God gave his people, and not only on what not to eat and what to eat, but also how they were to be prepared in very particular certain ways. And obviously the Babylonian chefs, they don't cook this way and they don't use these ingredients. And so what we see here, it's not about Daniel being on a diet. Or this is not the Daniel diet here. And it's not about him being picky or having certain food preferences. It's about him being faithful to the commandments that God had put on the community. Okay? Daniel's trying to be faithful. Right? And so rather than defile himself, Daniel chose to deny himself. Rather than defile himself, Daniel chose to deny himself. Test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. And so this is the end of our passage today. Daniel, he proposes this test to prove that he's not going to be missing out on anything, right? Because there's a bit of a concern. Oh, I can't, you have to eat well. You're supposed to be well taken care of. And Daniel says, no, let's put this to a test, right? And notice he says, 10 days, and if I'm worse off, fine. But if I'm okay, then we won't eat this stuff. Now notice this. Before, it said he had resolved not to defy himself. And now in these verses, he's speaking for others too. He says, test your servants, right? Let our appearance. And then he tested them. And he says, like, all, the youths. And I think we're supposed to infer that he's talking about Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, and Daniel. It seems like these four of them would not defile themselves. And you know how the story goes. We just read it. God kept them healthy. In fact, they were even better in appearance and fatter in flesh, right, than the other youths who ate all the other stuff. And again, this is not to prove the benefits of the Daniel diet or eating kosher or vegan or anything like that. This test was to prove 2 points. When we honor God, God honors us. When we honor God, God honors us. Daniel's chief motivation was that he wanted to stay faithful to the laws of God. I mean, in that time, amongst the Jewish community, those laws, they were binding on him. Okay, and so Daniel felt that it is essential that he continue to worship God by not eating these unclean foods. This was his way of honoring God, and we see by the end of the story that God honored him and God honored them. And we are to see this as a supernatural event, because naturally that wouldn't really happen. I mean, how could teenage boys who only ate veggies and drank water be stronger and healthier and fatter than those who feasted on all-you-can-eat buffet, right, and drank wine and alcohol, right? It doesn't make sense, right? I've worked with teenage boys before for years, and they're carnivores, okay? To only eat veggies and drink water, right? For a teenage boy, it's not gonna work, okay? They would rather starve, I think. So this doesn't make much sense, and we are supposed to see this as God's gracious provision, protection, providence, whatever you want to call it. God enabled them, helped them, right? I was reading this story, and this isn't very clear. It's not very clear in the Bible what this is, but I want to bring your attention to this. Okay, so I'm sure that Nebuchadnezzar brought more than just 4 youths from Jerusalem. Back in verse 6, it actually says, right, among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Okay, so presumably there were a bunch of Jewish youths, boys, who were brought into the king's service and given these foods. And presumably there were other Jewish youths who ended up compromising and eating of the king's food and conforming to the Babylonian ways and culture, presumably. Yet we only know the names of these 4. The ones who are recorded are the ones who stayed faithful, right? But there were others, I'm pretty sure. And if that's the case, then the others actually missed out on God's blessing. The others missed out on God's blessing. And those who thought they were going to miss out by giving up meat were actually the ones who missed out. And this leads me to my second point. Self-denial is better than self-defilement. When we give up something for the sake of our faith, for the sake of wanting to honor God or keep ourselves pure, we should be strengthened. We should be encouraged by the fact that we aren't actually missing out. We are actually gaining so much more by honoring God, by staying faithful, by keeping pure. We are actually gaining so much more. We are gaining a clean conscience. We are gaining a good witness. We are building our character, our self-control, exercising our self-control. We are possibly even obtaining a more favorable outcome, as was the case in Daniel and these his friends. They ended up being healthier and even fatter. We may actually gain a more favorable outcome when we honor God. Self-denial is a way to exercise our faith, to build up our faith, actually. I mean, that's the principle of fasting. Right? We deny our lesser physical needs to satisfy our greater spiritual needs. So what are some of these things that we can give up for God? What are things we can give up that the culture around us says it's safe, it's legal, it's good, it's all good, just go ahead? What are things as Christians that we can give up? Premarital sex, pornography, explicit music, media, drinking, smoking, gambling. As Christians, we shouldn't feel like we are missing out by giving up certain things. We're not missing out. We're gaining something more. We are simply staying faithful in exile. Faithful in exile. We need to remember we are citizens of another kingdom. Right? The kingdom of God. We already talked about that. We follow the laws of another king, our Lord. My last point for today is this. Remember who you are, and remember whose you are. You were bought with a price. You belong to Christ. The culture, the society, Babylon, they will try to give you a new name and make you forget where you came from. They will try to tempt you with good things so that you might forsake what is better. But never forget who you are and whose you are. Stay faithful, even in the midst of a world that is constantly pressuring you to conform and to compromise. Honor God, and He will honor you. Happy 4th of July weekend, everybody. I am proud to be an American, okay? I am proud to be an American, but I am even prouder to be a follower of Jesus and your brother in Christ. Take care, be safe, we'll see you soon.